So I want you to just imagine for a second that you are kneeling in the bathing heat of the Egyptian desert.
Oh man, just the heat alone is brutal.
Right. It's absolutely relentless. You've been, sifting through sand for weeks, maybe even months. You're dealing with the blinding sun, the dust just constantly coating your throat.
Yeah, archaeology is definitely not as glamorous as the movies make it out to be.
Exactly. It's grueling work. But finally, your brush hits something solid, right? You clear away that top layer of sand and you're totally expecting the familiar.
Because when you dig in Egypt, you generally know exactly what you're going to get.
You do. You know the canon of Egyptian antiquity. You expect the broad, perfectly squared shoulders, that rigid, highly idealized posture.
Right, that timeless, stoic face just staring off into eternity.
Exactly, with that absolute mathematical symmetry. That is what you expect because, well, that is what Egyptian artisans produced with just unwavering consistency for literally thousands of years.
It was a machine, a cultural machine of consistency.
But then, as you clear the sand away from this particular piece, what actually emerges is just profoundly unsettling.
It throws you completely off balance.
It really does. The proportions are so bizarre, the anatomy is so distorted and, I mean, almost alien, that your immediate instinct is to think you've uncovered some kind of mistake.
Or a forgery, maybe.
Right, or even like a mutant. It just totally defies every single rule of the aesthetic universe you thought you understood about this ancient culture.
Which creates this immediate, visceral sense of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at a culture that portrayed itself in a highly specific, idealized, and rigidly controlled way for millennia, finding an artifact that shatters that mold is deeply destabilizing.
It really makes you wonder what happened.
Exactly. It forces you to ask, what kind of societal collapse or massive trauma could possibly produce something so completely antithetical to their established reality.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at this incredibly weird 10-year blip in the otherwise impenetrable 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt.
A very brief moment where the entire system of reality was just completely inverted.
Yeah, it's wild. So our mission for this deep dive, and we have a really great stack of sources today, including some in-depth historical lecture notes and 3 very striking visual artifacts, is to center on the Amarna period.
This is the era led by Pharaoh Akhenaten during the 18th dynasty.
Right. And our goal is to really dissect the mechanics of this era to understand exactly why, the art from this specific decade looks incredibly amateurish, awkward, and fundamentally strange.
And to really appreciate the sheer scale of that strangeness, we need to firmly establish the baseline of the era first.
Right. Set the stage for how things normally work.
Exactly. For 2 millennia leading up to this point, Egyptian art was not an avenue for self-expression.
It wasn't about being creative.
No, not at all. It wasn't about an individual artist's avant-garde vision or, trying something new. It was a strict, mathematically precise, fundamentally unchanging formula.
Like a grid system, basically.
Literally a grid system, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
An observer looking at a statue from the Old Kingdom and then looking at one carved 1,000 years later would see identical rules applied.
The same proportions, the same poses.
Exactly. The proportions, the poses, the symbolism, it was all identical. The canon was locked in a deeply, deeply conservative tradition.
So the fact that it suddenly became chaotic and distorted implies a massive systemic failure.
Absolutely. Art doesn't just spontaneously mutate in a deeply conservative society without a massive catalyst.
Yeah, we can't really unpack the bizarre, spindly, distorted nature of these artifacts without looking at the political earthquake that actually necessitated their creation in the first place.
Right, the political landscape has to be the engine driving this entire episode.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the politics of the 18th dynasty really provide the exact blueprint for this artistic breakdown.
They really do. The pre-Amarna power dynamic was incredibly complex.
Right, because we always have this assumption that a pharaoh ruled as an absolute unchecked god king. Like, his word was law, end of story.
Which is the traditional narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
But when Amenhotep V, who is the pharaoh that would later change his name to Akhenaten, when he took the throne, his absolute power was actually heavily compromised.
He wasn't the only one calling the shots.
Not even close. He was sharing the stage and arguably losing ground to the priests of the god Amun.
We really need to look at the mechanics of that priesthood, because the capital at the time was Thebes, right?
Yeah.
And Amun was the chief deity.
Right, the absolute top of the pantheon.
And over generations, this specific priesthood hadn't just accumulated spiritual authority, they had amassed massive physical, tangible leverage over the entire state.
Oh, they functioned essentially as a parallel state.
Yeah.
I mean, the priesthood of Amun controlled vast agricultural estates, granaries, gold mines.
They basically owned the economy.
They completely owned it. They commanded their own labor forces and managed these intricate, massive supply chains.
Wow.
And, when you control the grain and the wealth in an agrarian society, you control the populace.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
So the high priests of Amun were literally dictating policy. They were influencing royal succession and acting as this massive geopolitical anchor that was just dragging on the pharaoh's autonomy.
So I'm trying to picture the reality of being the pharaoh in that situation. It's kind of like being a modern CEO, right?
What do you mean?
Well, you have the fancy title, you have the corner office, but you suddenly realize the board of directors actually owns all the company's assets and has the loyalty of all the employees.
That is actually a very good analogy, yeah.
Right, because you wake up in your palace in Thebes, you have the divine title, the royal lineage, but this religious bureaucracy surrounding you actually owns the infrastructure of your kingdom.
And you can't just decree them out of existence.
Exactly. You can't just fire them because they hold the loyalty of the people and they literally control the economy.
Right.
So how does a monarch dismantle an entrenched shadow government that claims a divine mandate? I mean, how do you even approach that?
Well, you dismantle their infrastructure.
Just take away their toys.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a direct military confrontation or, say, a mass execution of the priests would have likely triggered a catastrophic civil war.
The people would have revolted.
Instantly. So, Amenhotep V understood that as long as he remained in Thebes, he was playing on the priesthood's territory. He was bound by their economic and their social networks.
Right.
So his solution was an act of staggering political audacity. He just packed up the entire bureaucratic apparatus of the state and moved the capital.
Which is insane to think about. And he didn't just relocate to Memphis or, another established city with its own localized power structure.
That would just mean trading one set of powerful priests for another.
Exactly. He chose a completely barren, uninhabited expanse of desert.
He selected a site with zero historical baggage.
Yeah.
Zero established power centers, and most importantly, zero priests of Amun. He ordered the construction of a new city called Akhenaten, which is known today as Amarna.
And the logistics of this are just difficult to overstate.
Oh, it's a nightmare.
Right. He demanded the creation of a magnificent, fully functioning capital city. We're talking palaces, administrative buildings, temples, housing for tens of thousands of bureaucrats, soldiers, and artisans.
All in the middle of nowhere.
All in the middle of an unforgiving desert environment, effectively overnight.
The supply chain nightmare alone is just staggering.
Seriously, just imagine the water alone.
Oh, yeah. You're suddenly diverting all the quarried stone, all the grain, and all the fresh water to a place that has absolutely no natural capacity to support a massive population.
But this wasn't just about escaping Thebes, was it? There is a brutal economic reality to this relocation.
There really is. The physical move was basically just the mechanism for a massive wealth transfer.
A hostile takeover.
A literal hostile takeover. By establishing a new capital and simultaneously declaring new religious edicts, he systematically decommissioned the traditional temples.
Right.
And when you legally close the temples of Amun, the vast estates, the granaries, and the treasuries those priests controlled don't just disappear.
Right. They're absorbed by the crown.
Instantly.
Yeah.
The generationally hoarded wealth of the Amun priesthood was confiscated and funneled directly into the pharaoh's new administrative and religious establishment.
That is so ruthless.
It is. He totally annihilated the economic foundation of his rivals while simultaneously filling his own coffers to fund this massive new city.
Okay, so the political and economic strategy is ruthless and brilliant. You neutralize the rivals, you take their money.
Check and mate.
Right. But moving the physical capital is only half the battle. Because to ensure they couldn't just, wait him out or incite a massive rebellion from the provinces, he had to completely rewrite the spiritual reality of the Egyptian people.
He had to change how they thought.
Exactly. Because if the populace still fundamentally believes that the priests of Amun control their access to the afterlife, the pharaoh is still highly vulnerable.
Which is exactly why the relocation was paired with a complete religious revolution.
Right.
Akhenaten engineered a top-down theological paradigm shift. He totally abolished the state sponsorship of Amun and the wider Egyptian pantheon, and he elevated a single supreme deity.
Aten. Right, Aten, the sun disk. And this shift to the sun disk brings us directly to the first visual source we need to examine for this deep dive.
It's a fascinating piece.
It really is. So for you listening, picture this stone relief carved into a flat slab. It depicts Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, and they're seated on these unadorned chairs, just interacting with their children.
Very casual for a royal portrait.
Right, which we'll get into later. But above them, dominating the entire upper register of the carving, is this massive, perfectly circular sun disk.
And the interaction between that sun disk and the royal family is where the theology is physically manifested. Just look at the way the rays are depicted in this source.
Yeah, the rays extend straight down from the disk, but instead of simply tapering off into light like you'd expect, each individual ray ends in a miniature, distinctly carved human hand.
Such a specific detail.
It is. And those tiny hands are reaching down, hovering right in front of the faces of the king and queen, holding the ankh, which is the symbol of life, directly to their noses.
Right, and that imagery, the ankh being presented to the nose, is the established visual language for the breath of life.
Right.
In traditional Egyptian theology, the gods bestow the breath of life upon humanity in various ways. But here, in this specific carving, the composition is highly exclusive.
It's very restricted.
Very. Aten's rays, and those hands holding the breath of life, they are not directed at the wider world or the common people. They are exclusively directed at the royal family.
Okay, so he is visually codifying himself as the absolute bottleneck for divine favor.
Exactly. He is establishing the concept of the sole mediator. The theological edict was completely unambiguous. Only I know Aten's will. Under the old system, spirituality was very decentralized. I mean, a normal person could visit a local shrine, they could leave an offering for a minor deity, or just consult a local priest to navigate their spiritual concerns.
Right, there was a complex, accessible web of divine interaction.
Yeah, but Akhenaten dismantled that entire web. He positioned himself so that the only way to access the divine, the only way to secure your place in eternity, was directly through him.
So he essentially merged the apex of political power with the apex of spiritual authority.
He became the living God on earth and the sole conduit for religious salvation, all rolled into one.
It's centralized power to an unprecedented degree. But, it leaves us with a really critical socio-historical question.
Which is?
How do you enforce a top-down deletion of a 1,000-year-old belief system on the ground level? I'm stuck on the logistics of that reality.
It's a massive problem.
Right. You have an agrarian workforce. You have builders, artisans, people whose entire daily rhythm and understanding of the universe are tied to these ancient gods.
Yeah, you can't just send out a memo.
Exactly. You can't just issue a decree from a newly built desert palace and expect the collective psychology of an entire nation to pivot seamlessly overnight. The friction there must have been absolutely immense.
The friction was catastrophic.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to the visual evidence of that trauma.
Right, the art itself.
Because the art of the Amarna period is not just a stylistic choice. It is the physical, carved evidence of a terrified workforce attempting to execute an impossible top-down mandate.
Let's really examine that physical evidence, because looking at image 2 and image 3 in our sources is genuinely jarring.
They are quite shocking.
Let's start with image 2. So this is a statue of the pharaoh. He is in a traditional pose, arms crossed tightly over the chest, holding the crook and flail.
The standard royal pose, yeah.
But the anatomy is deeply disturbing. He has this distinct, sagging, bulging belly. The pelvis is abnormally wide, swelling out beneath a pinched waist, which gives the lower half of the torso an almost feminine weight.
Yeah.
And branching off this heavy center are incredibly slender, spindly, almost fragile-looking arms and legs.
It completely subverts the established geometry of a god king.
Completely.
I mean, the traditional pharaoh is depicted with broad, powerful shoulders and a narrow waist. A geometry that specifically projects eternal strength and stability.
Right, like an idealized superhero.
Exactly. But this statue projects fragility and just severe disproportion.
And image 3, which is a bust of just the head and shoulders, compounds that feeling even more. The skull is radically elongated, stretching backward and upward in a way that just defies human osteology.
It doesn't look human.
No, it doesn't. The cheekbones are sharp and pronounced, the eyes are these narrow slits, and the jawline tapers down into a severe, elongated point.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, without the context of ancient Egypt, a modern observer would look at this and just assume it was a conceptual design for an extraterrestrial.
And Honestly, early Egyptologists were equally baffled by this sudden extreme deviation.
Oh, really? What did they think?
Well, there were decades of medical speculation.
Ah, trying to diagnose the statues.
Exactly. Scholars theorize that Akhenaten must have suffered from severe genetic anomalies like Marfan syndrome or Furlich's syndrome or some kind of extreme glandular disorder.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they assume that the artists were simply rendering his actual physical deformities with brutal realism.
Okay, but looking at our sources for today, they make it incredibly clear that this wasn't a medical textbook rendering.
No, not at all.
This was the deliberate hallmark of Amarna art. And what our deep dive reveals, and here's where it gets really interesting, is that this grotesque, mutant-like appearance wasn't some visionary artistic movement and it wasn't a medical documentary.
Right.
It was the byproduct of a workforce operating under immense psychological terror and simultaneously suffering a complete technical breakdown.
And to really understand the mechanism of that breakdown, we have to understand what the act of carving stone actually meant to an Egyptian artisan.
It wasn't just decoration.
See, we look at a statue and we see a representation, we see art. But in ancient Egypt, especially in a royal or religious context, art was a form of literal functional magic.
Right. The sources emphasize this concept heavily. The carving didn't just represent the pharaoh, it dictated the physical reality of the pharaoh in the afterlife.
The execution of the art was an act of cosmic engineering, basically.
Wow.
And this is intimately tied to the fundamental Egyptian concept of Maat.
M-A-A-T. Right.
Right. Maat is the overarching principle of truth, balance, order, and justice. The universe functioned specifically because Maat was maintained.
Okay.
So the rigid mathematical rules for depicting the human form had been perfected over centuries, specifically to ensure that Maat was preserved in the eternal realm.
So it's not about aesthetics, it's about physics, spiritual physics.
Exactly. To alter those proportions wasn't simply a matter of bad taste or trying something new. It was an act of literal cosmic sabotage.
Oh, wow. Okay, so put yourself in the position of a master stone carver during this transition. You have spent your entire life, maybe your father's life before you, mastering the precise geometry required to maintain the universe's order.
Your entire worldview is built on this math.
Yes. And you believe, with absolute conviction, that this geometry guarantees eternal life.
Right.
And then suddenly, the living pharaoh orders you to abandon the gods you secretly still fear. And he commands you to carve his image in a bizarre, distorted, unprecedented shape.
The psychological pressure is just unimaginable.
It has to be terrifying.
You are trapped in a state of paralyzing cognitive dissonance. Because if you follow the Pharaoh's orders, you are committing ultimate blasphemy, you're actively destroying Maat, and you're condemning yourself and the king to eternal chaos.
But if you refuse...
If you refuse, the living absolute monarch, the man who literally just dismantled the most powerful priesthood in the world and dragged the entire government out into the desert, will have you executed on the spot.
It's an impossible bind. You are terrified of divine retribution, of having your soul damned forever, but you are equally terrified of the dictator standing right in front of you.
Exactly.
And that terror, that profound existential anxiety, it bleeds directly into the stone. Our sources point out that when you analyze these Amarna statues closely, you don't see the confident, powerful strikes of a master at ease.
No, you see hesitation.
Right. The solidity and eternal calm of traditional statuary are replaced by something that feels nervous and deeply uncomfortable.
And, the psychology perfectly explains that hesitant execution. But the sheer awkwardness of the proportions, the stretched necks, the bulging bellies, that is the result of a catastrophic technical failure.
Right, because they weren't just terrified, they were technically handicapped.
Exactly. The psychological terror was heavily compounded by the fact that the pharaoh dismantled the fundamental engineering system they relied on.
This is where we really need to look at the grid system. Because they didn't just eyeball these statues for thousands of years,
Yeah,
right?
definitely not.
They relied on a very strict mathematical framework.
Right. The consistency of Egyptian art was guaranteed by the 18-square grid.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, before a chisel ever touched the stone, an artist would map out a grid of exactly 18 equal squares from the baseline of the feet all the way up to the hairline.
Okay.
And every single anatomical feature had a strictly assigned coordinate.
It wasn't up for debate.
No debate. The knees were always anchored at line 6. The shoulders spanned a specific, non-negotiable width.
So it allowed a huge team, like 50 different apprentices and masters, to work on a massive temple wall and produce hundreds of figures that were mathematically identical.
Exactly. It was muscle memory totally codified into a drafting system.
But Akhenaten completely abolished that system, didn't he?
He threw it right out the window. He mandated a brand new 20-square grid.
Okay.
He ordered the artists to lower the center of gravity, to drop the belly, and to elongate the neck and the head so they would occupy the additional space at the top of the grid.
Okay, wait, I need to challenge this logically for a second.
Sure. We are talking about the workforce that engineered the monuments of Egypt.
True.
They were master spatial thinkers. I mean, if a modern architect is forced to use a new drafting software, they might grumble, right? It might slow them down a bit, but their buildings don't suddenly look structurally unsound.
That's a fair point.
So why couldn't these master craftsmen just adapt the math to a 20-square grid and make it look aesthetically cohesive?
Well, because of the timeline.
The timeline.
Yeah, the critical variable missing from your architect analogy is time. Akhenaten did not just decree a new art style, he decreed the immediate construction of an entire imperial capital in a desert wasteland.
Oh, right. The logistics of building Amarna overnight.
Exactly. He mobilized thousands of laborers and artisans, dragged them into an incredibly harsh environment, and placed them under tyrannical deadlines to build palaces, administrative centers, and literally thousands of new statues and reliefs to legitimize the new religion.
So they were just rushing.
They were working at a breakneck, totally desperate pace. So let me get this straight. They are working under the constant threat of execution. They are internally terrified of spiritual damnation because they're breaking Mot. And on top of all that, they're given an impossible deadline.
Yeah.
So they had absolutely zero time to practice or refine this new 20-square grid.
None. Zero. Developing a unified, harmonious aesthetic standard requires decades of trial, error, and refinement.
Right. The 18-square grid took centuries to perfect.
Exactly. The 18-square grid was the result of centuries of subtle calibration. The artisans at Amarna were basically handed a theoretical 20-square mandate, told to stretch the anatomy, and ordered to mass-produce it immediately.
And because they had never studied human anatomy. I mean, they'd only ever studied the math of the 18-square grid, right?
Right, they weren't drawing from life models.
Exactly. So they didn't actually know how a human body connects when you say, stretch a neck or lower a pelvis.
They completely lacked the anatomical foundation to improvise gracefully.
Yeah.
So in their panic and under immense time pressure, they simply forced the old familiar shapes to just stretch and warp so they can hit the new grid lines.
They were literally just guessing.
Totally guessing.
They pulled the neck upward to hit the new top line, they widened the hips to fill the expanded lower squares, and the result was the mass production of these clumsy, exaggerated, mutant-like figures.
Which is exactly what we see in the sources.
Right. It wasn't a cohesive artistic vision at all. It was a rushed, panicked compromise between ancient muscle memory, an untested new drafting rule, and a brutal deadline.
The source notes actually summarize this perfectly as the limitations of a hasty revolution.
I love that phrase.
It's so accurate. It's a profound historical lesson, honestly. A dictator can command the construction of a city. They can change the foundational drafting grid by decree, but they absolutely cannot instantly rewire the spatial reasoning, the deeply ingrained habits, and the physical muscle memory of an entire workforce. The grotesque nature of Amarna art is basically just the physical friction between a top-down theoretical mandate and the ground-level reality of human limitations.
That is fascinating. So, what happens when the pressure valve is finally released?
Oh, it's dramatic.
I bet. When the dictator driving this massive, terrifying, high-speed experiment finally dies, what happens?
The societal snapback is immediate, and it is violent.
Really?
Oh, yeah. When Akhenaten died, the Amarna period basically collapsed almost instantly. The throne eventually passed to his young son, Tutankhamun, who, very tellingly, quickly changed his name to something much more familiar to us, Tutankhamun.
Oh, he re-embraced Amun. He put the old god's name right back into his own name.
Exactly. The very first acts of Tutankhamun's administration were to completely dismantle his father's experiment.
It just undid the whole thing.
The desert capital of Amarna was abandoned, left to the wind. The court moved back to Thebes. The temples of Amun were reopened, the immense wealth was returned to the priesthood, and critically, the artists immediately reverted back to the flawless, mathematically sound 18-square grid.
So the cosmic order was restored, Marat was achieved again.
And everyone breathed a massive sigh of relief.
I can imagine. But I have to assume the returning regime was incredibly hostile toward the distorted mutant artwork left sitting out there in the desert.
Oh, they viewed it as abhorrent heresy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The successors to Akhenaten, particularly a military commander turned pharaoh named Horemheb, initiated a campaign of total systematic erasure.
They wanted to wipe him from history?
Completely. They marched right back into the abandoned city of Amarna. They systematically smashed the temples of Aten. They tore down all the bizarre statues and attempted to obliterate every textual and visual record that this chaotic 10-year period ever even existed.
Wow.
And then they buried all the shattered remnants deep in the sand.
The historical irony there is just incredible.
Is it?
By attempting to violently erase these terrifying failed artworks from the historical record, by burying them deep in the dry, protective desert sand, they inadvertently created the perfect conditions for their preservation.
It's the best thing they could have done for archaeologists. If they had simply left Amarna standing, the city would have slowly weathered away over the centuries, or later generations would have just repurposed the stone for new building projects, essentially grinding the art into dust.
Right.
But by aggressively burying it, they effectively vacuum-sealed a 10-year societal nervous breakdown for millennia.
They gave us a pristine, localized time capsule. It's amazing. But, before we wrap this up, there's one final, incredibly poignant detail in the sources regarding Image 1.
The relief of the family under the sun disk.
Yeah, that one. We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing the fear, the awkwardness, and the heavy religious propaganda, but the sources point out something entirely different in the actual behavior of the figures in that carving.
It's a really touching detail, actually. If you look past the distorted proportions, the weird heads and the skinny arms, and focus on the action, it is deeply intimate.
It really is.
Akhenaten is depicted gently holding one of his young daughters, bringing her to his face in what looks like a kiss.
Yeah.
And Nefertiti sits opposite him with another daughter perched playfully on her lap, seemingly just tugging at her mother's elaborate jewelry or garments.
It's just a scene of domestic life. They're just playing with their kids.
And that is staggering when you place it in the wider context of Egyptian history.
Yeah, they never showed that, right?
Never. We do not see domestic vulnerability in royal art before this period, and we never see it after.
Right.
Traditional pharaohs are immortalized in acts of conquest, smiting enemies or standing in rigid, stoic perfection alongside the gods. They're deliberately stripped of their everyday humanity.
So for all the psychological terror, all the bizarre mandates, and the massive technical failures of the Amarna period, the breaking of those rigid rules actually allowed for a fleeting, incredibly rare glimpse of genuine human warmth to be carved into the stone.
It's a beautiful paradox.
It really is. So let's pull all these threads together. When you look at the bizarre proportions of Amarna art, the elongated skulls, the heavy sagging bellies, the fragile limbs, you aren't just looking at the eccentric stylistic choices of a weird king.
Not at all.
You are looking at the physical scars of a workforce in crisis. These statues are the tangible byproduct of terrified artisans caught in an inescapable trap between the wrath of a living dictator, the absolute dread of a divine curse, and an impossible construction deadline utilizing a grid system they had absolutely no time to understand.
It is a powerful reminder that art and architecture are never, ever generated in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They are always the exact physical manifestation of the economic pressures, the political realities, and the psychological state of the laborers wielding the tools.
It reveals something fundamental about human nature, I think. A powerful leader can legally confiscate wealth, they can mandate new belief systems, and they can even force a population to build a brand new civilization in a wasteland.
They have that power.
Right. But you cannot simply decree a change in human muscle memory, in ingrained technical habits, and deep-seated psychological beliefs overnight. When a regime tries to force a massive revolution that quickly, the results on the ground are always going to be distorted.
And if we extrapolate that historical friction to the modern world, it raises a fascinating question for you to think about.
Oh, definitely.
Consider the massive organizations, the huge tech conglomerates or political systems of our era.
Right.
When leadership attempts to force rapid, sweeping, top-down innovations without giving the workforce the time, the tools, or the psychological runway to adapt. What kinds of awkward, hastily assembled mutant artifacts are we mass-producing today?
Wow, yeah.
What are the bizarre, dysfunctional creations of our own hasty revolutions that future historians will dig out of our digital sands and struggle to comprehend?
That is exactly the kind of question that makes digging through these sources so rewarding. A massive thank you to you, the listener, for joining us as we unpack the strange, terrifying, and ultimately deeply human story of the Amarna period.
Thank you for your time, and continue to question the narratives left behind in the stone.
Until next time, keep exploring.